Maybe they'll answer the question for us.
Welcome to Washington.
Will the U.S. run out of countries
Just
to
to be
bomb?
clear that everyone
At
is in
some
the right
point.
place, I did a panel earlier this week
Maybe. They might.
on Ayn Rand, and half the people in the room thought they were there for a panel about Iran. I'm just checking, and this panel is about Lenin, yeah? Okay. All right. We already know this one. We will be running from 5 until 7, and we're using wireless mics, so if you can manage to be off your phones, or at least not receive calls for the next 2 hours, we would really appreciate it. And if you can't manage that, at least tell us who's calling, because they better be really interesting. If you can put your phones on silent, that would be great. Thank you. So, I am Laura Flanders, and I am here at the Left Forum, ever so glad to be joined by Chris Hedges, Rick Wolff, and our fantastic substitute for Tim Schermerhorn, Kali Akuno. Kali is joining us. And thank you especially, Kali, for showing up last minute and filling in, as you will do beautifully. We are in an interesting moment to be considering Lenin, and to be considering matters of social democracy, parties, central planning, propaganda. Lenin had a lot to say about propaganda and agitation and organizing. I think we have all of those things represented on this panel. He was probably a little bit more precise in the distinctions between those groups than we will be. But we are in a moment, I think, we're going back to thinking about the moment that Lenin worked in is not only smart, but almost compulsory. Think about it. A period of change in capitalism, the shift from competition to monopoly, land grabs, empire, fights over resources, spontaneous outbursts of protest, but a lot of disunity, a lot of exciting potential, but also a lot of potential for new forms of capital and capitalism to divide us. In Lenin's day, he talked about the working class being bought off by empire and the spoils of war and resources. In our period, I think we can say that we are, many of us, bribed on a daily basis by big stuff, like war and empire and resources, and white supremacy and cisgender privilege, and by little stuff, like a nice cool drink. We're confused, perhaps, some of us, about whether we have members or just followers, whether we have agreement or just a lot of likes. And we're very confused about how much time we should spend doing any particular thing in a period of crisis. So this conversation, I think, will be a very helpful one. And I will just say that we're going to go in the order of Chris first, Rick second, Kali second, and Rick third. And that this event is part of a series that we've been doing, I think, these many years, maybe 5 or 6 years here at the Left Forum, where we've been looking at classic texts. But on this occasion, we're less looking at a specific text than looking at the significance of a man and his writings and his work, namely Lenin. So, with no further ado, we will go let each of our presenters speak, have a little conversation amongst us, and then some time for questions. We will be recording, we are recording for video, we're also recording for the Laura Flanders Show. And if you're not familiar with the Laura Flanders Show, check it out at lauraflanders.org. It's the place where, as we say, the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. We're on TV, radio, and we'd love to have you with us. So, first up, Chris Hedges.
So Vladimir Lenin has two legacies. One is the brilliant revolutionary tactician. The second is Lenin, the new czar. He was, ironically, Russia's most fervent champion of the very thing he eradicated, revolutionary anarchy. His pamphlet, State and Revolution, was an unequivocal anarchist manifesto, with Lenin writing that as long as there is a state, there is no freedom, and when there is freedom, there will be no state. But Lenin, like Leon Trotsky in power, was an opportunist who made promises such as all power to the Soviets, he had no intention of keeping. He employed political terror, widespread arrests and executions to crush the autonomous, self-governing Soviets and workers' committees. He led a centralized, autocratic, ruling elite. He criminalized dissent, outlawed competing political parties, muzzled the press, and instituted a system of state capitalism which stripped workers of their autonomy and rights. He may have thought of himself like Robespierre, an idealist, but to quote Goethe, he desired the good, but created evil. Stalinism was not an aberration, it was the natural heir of Leninism. In power, as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, in the Russian Revolution, Leninism or Marxism, Lenin became the enemy of democratic socialism. He turned to the fanatic Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the newly formed Cheka, which during the first year of the revolution officially executed 6,300 people, which I expect is a huge underestimate. This was the same Lenin who in November 1917 said, "We do not apply terror as did the French revolutionaries who guillotined unarmed people, and I hope we shall never apply it." The anarchist Mikhail Akuno warned presciently that Marxists proposed to replace the capitalist with the bureaucrat. The Marxist society, he said, was nothing more than capitalism under centralized state management, and it would, he said, be even more oppressive. This is why Noam Chomsky correctly calls Lenin the dictator, a right-wing deviation, and a counter-revolutionary. But there is no denying Lenin's brilliance. He redefined the political landscape of the 20th century. Decades after the Russian Revolution, in Spain, China, Cuba, Vietnam, and South Africa, oppressed peoples looked to Lenin and the revolution for inspiration. The social inequality and destruction of democratic institutions wrought by neoliberalism and the corporate seizure of power in our own time gives Lenin, who is examining many of the same questions about despotism, imperialism, and capitalism, relevancy. Lenin the revolutionary has a lot to teach us. He, like John Dewey, understood that as long as the capitalist class has control of the means of production, no real democracy is ever possible. Lenin was acutely aware that revolutions occur because of spontaneous combustions that no one, including the revolutionaries, can predict. The February 1917 revolution was, like the French storming of the Bastille, an unexpected and unplanned popular eruption. As the hapless Alexander Kerensky pointed out, the Russian Revolution came of its own accord, unengineered by anyone, born in the chaos of the collapse of Tsarism. This is true for all revolutions. The tinder is there. What sets it alight is a mystery. The key to success, this is also true for all revolutions, is the refusal by the police and military, as occurred in Petrograd, to restore order and defend the old regime. Trotsky asserted that decayed regimes inevitably elevate leaders of stunning incompetence, corruption, and imbecility, figures like Tsar Nicholas II or Donald Trump. Even the elites, in the end, do not want to defend them. The ossified systems of governance evidenced in the United States by our corrupt, corporate-managed elections, our dysfunctional Congress, our commercialized press, and our failed judiciary, which just legalized gerrymandering, an updated version of Great Britain's 19th century rotten borough system, are transparent puppets of the ruling cabal. Reform through these structures is impossible. This understanding creates a huge divide between the liberals who hold out hope for reform, and you can see them once again foolishly investing time and energy in the Democratic Party. Hope none of you watch the debates. And revolutionaries who seek not to placate or work within the system, but to destroy it. Lenin, like Marx, understood that revolutions were not made by the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat is more often the enemy of revolution and the natural ally of fascists. They gravitate to reactionary, armed, vigilante groups lured by the intoxication of violence and build their warped ideology around conspiracy theories and white supremacy. We see this among some Trump supporters and among white militias and hate groups. Lenin had a temperamental dislike of intellectuals, but he knew there was no other class that could shape and lead a revolutionary movement. This is why he relied so heavily on intellectuals such as Trotsky and Lev Kamenev, who would be liquidated by Stalin. Revolutionaries, Lenin said, must be constantly self-critical and self-reflective. They must closely examine and learn from failures and defeats. They must be steeped in history, philosophy, and the study of economics and culture. They must have a single-minded devotion to the cause, a disdain for personal security, an iron discipline and adherence to the party hierarchy, a slavish devotion to duty, and the ability to submerge their personalities into the group. Revolutionaries, however utopian their ideals, must also be political realists. He did not like doctrinal purity, reminding his followers that theory is a guide, not a holy writ. Lenin knew that most intellectuals, he and Trotsky being exceptions, however, lacked the ability to act quickly and decisively. This would explain why Lenin turned increasingly in power to thugs such as Stalin and Yakov Sverdlov, who oversaw the execution of the deposed Tsar and his family. Trotsky, for all his brilliance as an orator and the commander of the Red Army, had little interest in the mundane day-to-day mechanics of governing, a deficiency that would see Stalin push him for power, force him into exile, and eventually send a secret agent to Mexico to plunge an ice pick into his head. Revolutions are invariably led by messianic leaders, such as Cromwell or Robespierre, who have the strange combination of high ideals, as Crane Brinton writes, and a complete contempt for the inhibitions and principles which serve most other men as ideals. These revolutionary leaders are not, Brinton points out, Plato's philosopher kings, but philosopher killers. These qualities allow them to sweep aside the moderates who are given nominal power after a revolution and forge revolutionary parties into effective machines. These qualities allow them to crush the forces of reaction that inevitably rise up to destroy the revolutionary order. Lenin and Trotsky had to swiftly mobilize to fight the Tsarist white armies and their foreign allies on a dozen fronts shortly after taking power. Mass uprisings, Lenin understood, provide fleeting moments that, if not seized by the revolutionary, may never occur again. In these moments, the revolutionary must skillfully exploit the self-destructive delusions that blind and paralyze the ruling elites and ride the wave of unrest to power. Timing was all, Lenin repeated monotonously. At timing, Lenin was a master. There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen, he wrote. Lenin abhorred anarchist violence, the propaganda of the deed, the anarchist assassination of czars, princes, empresses, presidents, and prime ministers which he dismissed as acts of neurotic self-indulgence, never had and never would, he pointed out, instigate a popular uprising. Terrorism, he wrote, quickly demoralizes those who practice it and destroys the revolutionary group that resorts to it. He would have excoriated the adolescent vandalism and lack of coherent organization and ideas that define the Black Bloc and Antifa. Lenin called these renegade anarchists liberals with bombs, because they, like liberals, believed that propaganda alone of deed and word would bring about radical change. As Lenin pointed out, terrorism and violence only frightened the population, demonized and isolated the revolutionaries, and legitimated state repression. Violence was never a substitute for mass mobilization. It was never a substitute for the long and tedious work of building a revolutionary political party, as colleague and his colleagues have done in Jackson. And without a revolutionary party, Lenin warned correctly, revolution was impossible. The utter uselessness of terror is clearly shown by the experience of the Russian revolutionary movement. Lenin wrote, although his brother was executed in a failed plot to assassinate the Tsar, individual acts of terrorism create only a short-lived sensation and lead in the long run to an apathy and the passive awaiting of yet another sensation. Revolutions may be made by militant minorities, but their power comes from articulating the conscious aspirations of most of society. The obsession with specific ruling figures, rather than the structures of repressive power, divert attention from the most important targets. Lenin referred to the Tsar as the idiot Romanov and told his fellow Bolsheviks he was a person of little consequence. He would have dismissed our preoccupation with Donald Trump. Corporate totalitarianism, with its wholesale surveillance, endless wars, militarized police, transference of wealth upwards, austerity programs, collapse of infrastructure and basic social services from education to health, ecocide, punishing debt peonage, and disempowering and impoverishment of workers all predated Trump. Mike Davis in Prisoners of the American Dream illustrates how waves of state violence and repression against the working class and the left by Democratic and Republican administrations has effectively preempted the emergence of socialism in the United States. Lenin warned that when capitalism is seriously threatened, fascism is always the default option, not only for the ruling elites, but for the liberal class. The liberals who fear the radical left become, in a revolutionary movement, the revolutionary's enemy. Lenin, like Trotsky, closely studied the French Revolution and the Paris Commune. When the French elites could not get the invading Prussians to destroy the Commune, they did it themselves, leaving 30,000 dead, of whom 14,000 men and women were executed. After World War I, the German Minister of Defense, Gustav Noske, a member of the Social Democratic Party, organized and took command of World War I veterans organized in the Freikorps, a right-wing militia. Noske used the Freikorps, the antecedent of the Nazi Party, to crush the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919, and the Marxist Spartacus League uprising, which included the abduction and assassination of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg on January 15, 1919. Marshal Philippe Pétain and the Vichy collaborators in World War II allied themselves with the Nazi occupiers to thwart what they feared would be a communist uprising in France. Lenin argued that the most effective way to weaken the resolve of the ruling elite was to tell it exactly what to expect. This audacity and brazenness, while it attracts the notice of state security, does not lead to public hostility to the revolutionary movement. Indeed, it gives the movement an allure and cachet. The revolutionary must, he wrote, make unequivocal demands that, if met, would mean the obliteration of the current power structure. And the revolutionary must never compromise on these demands. The public exposure of corrupt centers of power, including the military, saps the confidence and credibility of the ruling elites. As a revolutionary force gathers momentum, the ruling elites attempt to make concessions that further weaken their credibility and strength. Imperial powers, he saw, were especially vulnerable and fragile. They were not self-contained, but instead depended on the exploitation of foreign resources and foreign labor, as well as a vast military machine that drains the state of resources. Imperialism brings with it corporate monopolies, a characteristic of the late stage of capitalism. It shifts power away from the manufacturing class to a parasitic class of financiers, the rentiers, whose profession, Lenin wrote, is idleness. The late stage of capitalism inverts classical economics. What was considered unproductive, the parasitism of the rentier class, becomes the real economy. And what was considered the productive sector of the economy, labor and industry, is treated as the parasite. The ascendancy of global speculators is deadly to the capitalist system, which slowly consumes itself. Luxemburg, who was perhaps the only contemporary Marxist that was Lenin's intellectual equal, and who was assassinated in 1919 by Prussian officers, foresaw the danger of Lenin's iron rule over the party and eventually Russia itself. She was as fierce an opponent of the capitalist order and imperialism as Lenin, but opposed centralized authority and chastised Lenin's implicit contempt for the working class. Any revolution that justified, as Lenin did, a dictatorship, even if he insisted it was temporary, was dangerous. The only way to protect revolutionary socialism from autocracy and calcification was to empower the population through democratic institutions and freedom of expression. She wrote, "Freedom only for the supporters of the government, only for the members of one party, however numerous they may be, is no freedom at all. Freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. Not because of any fanatical concept of justice, but because all that is instructive, wholesome, and purifying in political freedom depends on this essential characteristic, and its effectiveness vanishes when freedom becomes a special privilege." Luxemburg, in this sense, was the truer revolutionary. A socialist revolution would not be built through a self-anointed vanguard that dominated all aspects of society and culture, but through endless experimentation, creativity, dissent, open debate, reverses, and advances. Socialism, by its very nature, cannot be introduced by edict. Only unobstructed, effervescing life falls into 1,000 new forms and improvisations, brings to light a creative force, itself corrects all mistaken attempts. She went on, "But with the oppression of political life in the land as a whole, life in the Soviets must also become more and more crippled. Without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies and every public institution becomes a mere semblance of life in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element. Public life gradually falls asleep. A few dozen party leaders of inexhaustible energy and boundless experience direct and rule. Among them, in reality, only a dozen outstanding heads do the leading, and an elite of the working class is invited from time to time to meetings where they are to applaud the speeches of the leaders and to approve proposed resolutions unanimously. At bottom, then, a clique affair, a dictatorship to be sure, not, however, of the proletariat, but only a handful of politicians. Such conditions must inevitably cause a brutalization of public life, attempted assassinations, shooting of hostages, etc. Leninists, of course, will argue that the authoritarian tools Lenin and Trotsky used to build and protect the Soviet state were essential, that without them the revolution would have been destroyed. We cannot glibly dismiss this analysis, given the very real existential threats faced by the new revolutionary order and the multiplicity of forces arrayed against them. Bakunin and the anarchists may have been correct in their analysis of the dangers inherent in a centralized Bolshevik state, but then what? They do not offer to me convincing solutions, but instead present dreamy platitudes about voluntary cooperation and the federalism of communists. History has amply illustrated that if there is no revolutionary party, or if a revolutionary party is crushed, the forces of reaction triumph. We need only look at the rise to power of the French General Louis-Eugène Cavaignac, who crushed the 1848 uprisings in Paris, Louis Napoleon, the German General Wilhelm Greuner, who brutally put down the popular uprising following the country's defeat in World War I, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and in our own era, Suharto and Augusto Pinochet. The old Tsarist generals, starting with Lavar Kornilov, who a fellow general said was a man with the heart of a lion, brains of a sheep, were preparing, backed by their Western allies, to pounce on the new revolutionary order and snuff it out. But we can ask if the cost Lenin imposed is worth it. If we must create mirror images of autocracy and terror to endure, then we are no better than the monsters we sought to slay. Luxemburg was right. The ends never justify the means. Those who go down that road, who cast all morality aside as Lenin did, do not come back. And there is some evidence that as Lenin neared the end of his life, he was revolted by his creation. You think you are driving the machine, and yet it's driving you, and suddenly other hands than yours are on the wheel, Lenin lamented. Perhaps Lenin's greatest legacy is his political realism, his hatred of dogmatics, and meticulous study of power. If we do not understand power and how it works, we are doomed. Che Guevara's belief in his own propaganda, the doctrine of Folkismo, which argues that revolution is ignited by small armed rebel bands, not only led to his own death in Bolivia, but a series of failed uprisings in Latin America and Africa, and the foolish decision by the Leaders for Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, the largest anti-war movement in the United States during the Vietnam War, to implode itself to form its own FOCO, the Weather Underground. We can learn much from Lenin, the revolutionary, about what to do, and much from Lenin, the dictator, about what not to do, and Lenin would have insisted we do so.
Bear with us a second. Is that good? Sure. No? You gotta talk into it? All right, so bear with us, folks. I will do my best to fill in for Tim. Just found out about this a little bit last night, and didn't even get fully confirmed until this morning. So I'm really winging it, and Chris laid out so many things, both that I agree with and disagree with. So now my mind is grappling with that as opposed to just thinking straightforward about what to present. And then on top of that, before I really get into it, let me just note, I think it would be remiss to not mention, if any of you all knew Bruce Dixon from the Black Agenda Report, he passed a short while ago. His family decided, from my understanding, I'm looking for more information, but he had been battling cancer for a number of years, as I think many of you know. Evidently took a turn for the worse over the course of last week. He was actually planning on being here, as we noticed he's on. His name is listed on many panels, several panels, but it took a turn for the worse and the comrade passed on. So just for everybody to know that, to give note to his contributions throughout the weekend, just hold his work. I think it's impossible. One of the things that I love relative to this subject, Bruce and Glenn often piss many people off. Sometimes people think without merit. I beg to differ. I think it has clear merit and clear intentionality of raising certain strategic questions and us not being lazy or not skipping over a number of different things and really challenge each other to dig deeper and ask the questions that need to be asked. So I think in that regard, they definitely follow a particular portion of both what Lenin brought to the table, particularly in his youth, of challenging the orthodoxy of the Second International and ultimately where it would lead. So I'll start my comments off where I was going to go, some things that are, I think, really pertinent that Laura laid out that cover some of the ground. So what I really take in this moment from Lenin that I think is very valuable is number one, the methodology by which he drew his analysis and conclusions. I think that is often overlooked. And too often, much like Marx, people kind of look at certain kind of predictions as opposed to how did he come up with the conclusions that he came up with. What was the methodology? Because that is something that we can take and apply wherever we may be to both analyze our situation, kind of grasp the essence of what can be moved, what our forces can objectively do, and then come up with a strategy and plan to move on. That, I think, was one of his singular focuses, one of his geniuses, that many before him often missed or honestly chose to avoid. And I think he, regardless, this is where I think it would be worth of a larger conversation and discussion. One thing he didn't shy away from that I think is very much shied away from now is a serious conversation about power, right? How do we engage it? When we have it, how do we utilize it? Like that is something I think most of what constitutes or is calling itself the left today is avoiding in any serious fundamental way, and we can't avoid it. It's a dynamic that keeps repeating itself in history. And if you want to look at certain dynamics, one thing I always try to use when a lot of us get into certain kind of stale discussions about Lenin or Stalin or Trotsky in that particular period of reading of history, to say, well, look, I want you to go back a little bit further, about 100 years before that, 120 years before that, and look at the Haitian Revolution, and look at the contradictions of the Haitian Revolution, look at how the certain questions around how power was utilized, how dictatorship was imposed, why it was imposed, and we want to, every time we get to a critical point, where we can make some critical interventions and we can transform this thing, this question of power and the balance of being able to ward off our enemies, but also, broaden the practice of democracy. We're going to run into that every single time, and we better have some different answers to it the next time around. Otherwise, we'll just repeat the same dynamic. So item one, I relish the fact that we have the 20th century as a guide. I think a profoundly different view than most folks who just look at most of the 20th century, be it the Soviet Union, or be it China, or be it many of the third world so-called third world Marxist regimes as failures. I don't look at them that way. I think they were kind of necessary steps towards the actual realization of socialism. They did some things right, they did some things wrong. But given the dynamic of what they were all stacked up against, the mere audacity to both challenge imperial power and challenge capital, they had the right to make mistakes, just like we have the right to make mistakes. But the question is, how do we learn for the next go around? That's the real issue, right? And for me, I think there's, some critical things that I think Lenin had a particular focus on that we need to bring, I think, a little bit more to the forefront here. And one of the pieces is, how do you ground your practice where you are situated, where you work, where you live, where you play, where you engage, where you pray? How do you connect that to larger global movements and dynamics? That is a particular piece of Lenin's analysis, I think, of how he kind of really married what was going on in Russia and tied it to the global phenomenon of imperialism as it was growing and developing. That we cannot overlook. And that is something we don't do, I would argue, very forcefully in the here and now. We often skip over that or feel that it's too challenging for us to do on our own. And I would agree that it is too challenging for us to do as individuals to do on our own. But collectively, we have to do it, we have to engage it if we actually want to challenge this piece. And that piece, if we're going to do it collectively, then brings up a fundamental question of living, the question of organization. What type of organization do we need to build in the here and now to build the alternative from the ground up and then challenge ultimately or displace the powers that exist right now? That question is not going to go away. So this notion that we're going to change the world without taking power, engaging power to a certain extent, I don't think that's realistic. I mean, I can tell you from our little experiment in Jackson, just a little bit of ability to determine a few little tax codes here and building codes there, it has its importance. It has a strategic merit, but there's a lot more in terms of really breaking the power of capital and imperialism that comes in just winning elections, and we're going to need a much stronger force to really get us where we need to go, right? And it's going to take a higher level of coordination than I think any of us are ready to fathom right now. And that, again, I think is where Lenin comes back in. So we can have many debates on whether his articulation of the party was the correct one. I think in his circumstances, this is where I would disagree to a certain extent, I think in his particular circumstances it was. Is that the case under our circumstances? Perhaps not. But it doesn't negate the fact that we need to be organized. That's the central point. Then it's the question of what are we organized to do? Right? What are we aiming to accomplish? And then we have to do serious assessments of what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses. So this is the methodology that I think that he really perfected, that we need to look at and say, despite what you want to say about certain errors or faults in history, the methodology was fundamentally sound and is still applicable in the here and now. And that part I don't think anybody should necessarily jettison. And then I'll just end with this. I mean, there's a lot more to say, and hopefully we get to some debate around this. I really appreciated most Chris bringing up the dynamic around the forces and the developments that led to Trump. Right, as opposed to a singular focus on Trump. Because you could take him out of the equation. Capital had the need to reorganize the imperial system, whether he was going to be the primary instrument or somebody else was going to do it. That was on the table and it was on the agenda. It's going to be on the agenda regardless who wins in 2020. Right? Now, if they find somebody who uses slicker language and tone, but is still going to run concentration camps in effect, but does it with nice language or nice style or nice dictating, the objective reality of what exists is still there. Are we going to be posed enough to fight it, just because it's not in the news in the same bombastic way it is now? So deeper questions of organization, and I think a deeper grasp of reality is needed for us to really challenge what's going forward. And I think, this is the one thing I think that Lenin brought to the table that we really need to really, I think, grapple with. That my reading of Lenin, as opposed to even Luxemburg, it was always a certain element that sometimes you can read it as desperation, I don't, but there was always a serious sense of urgency in Lenin's writings and the perspective he brought around, look, these opportunities come around 1905, 1914. They only come around every so often. And damn it, when they come around, we need to be in place to intervene. That element of his analysis, I think, is sometimes sorely missed. And if we look at the challenge of, we seriously facing right now, square in the face, the extinction of complex life on this planet. So if we can't get urgent about that, we might as well throw in the towel. Like right now and give it up, right? So bring that particular piece in, it wasn't an urgency of desperation. It was realizing, I think, from concrete experience, particularly from 1905 and that experience, we could have did so much more if we'd been sufficiently organized. And we have to think about that over the course of, you just want to start with 2011. Well, let's say we start with 2008. How much different would the world be if the left was organized? Even organized to the level it was, say, in 1980. How much different would reality be right now? I want y'all to sit and grasp with that. Because one of the things I think that's going to exasperate the climate crisis here real quick is this financial bubble that we're living in, which at some point is going to pop. And by most calculations, Rick can probably break that down far better than I can. By most calculations, it's going to dwarf what happened in 2008. And the answer for it would be chaos for many of us, but the captains of finance, they have some nice bunkers, they have nice plans to go to Mars or to the moon, depending on which side you want to go with the Amazon side of the debate, or you want to go with the Elon Musk side of the debate. Regardless of which one, they're not planning on anybody in this room joining them. Which means we will be left here, basically scrambling in hell, unless we get our shit together and reorganize in a fundamental way. So let's sit with that, take that urgency to task. Thank you.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Very good.
I think without intending it, we have a bit of a progression here from a largely critical perspective from Chris to one a little bit, as you'll see in a minute, in the middle, and then I can come up and finish it off by presenting a more, I'm not sure what the word is, more appreciative, perhaps, perspective on what I think Lenin accomplished and why all of us on this panel think that engaging his work and his life is an important thing for people to do now in the United States. So do you not hear me? Let me go this way, go a little bit there. Okay. I want to begin by the context in which I try to understand Lenin. It's the context of trying to be a revolutionary in a society that is already pretty heavily mobilized against all of that. It is a very repressive society, as far as Russia, before you put it, in which the mass of people are wrapped up in levels of life activity, whether it's in the Russian Orthodox Church, which was very powerful at the time, or in the level of agrarian backwardness. You really have to remember that Russia at the time, beginning of the 20th century, was the Germany and France and England were literally light years away. Poverty was unspeakable. There were effectively little or no roads in the spring when it rained. Basically, life came to a stop. You could not get very far because the roads were impassable. Why do I tell you this? Because he was able to produce an analysis and an organization under conditions that make even what we have today, which is difficult, as Chris quite nicely summarized it, but really not comparable to what they had. And it had developed in Russia, for those of you familiar with Russian literature, a level of deep fatalism about life that you can read in Dostoevsky or any of all the others, that also immobilizes the population, the pointlessness of it all, the impossibility of breaking out of all of the constraints. To be a revolutionary under those circumstances, to sustain it all the decades that he did, to overcome everything from the execution of his brother that was talked about, on over to the countless arrests and tortures of friends and associates, and stay with it. Even exile, many years, as you know, out of the country to save his life, basically, is extraordinary and might help understand some of the achievement his life represents. Here's some of the things he kind of gets major credit for. He didn't do these things alone, obviously, but he gets some credit. He made a revolution in a country where no one thought it was going to happen anytime soon, including the people who lived there. He then successfully led an effort to sustain their little fragile revolution in a civil war. A civil war in which all of the forces inside Russia, arrayed against what he was trying to do, mobilized and got massive help from outside Russia. I always remind the audiences, not that any of you need it, but I remind audiences that 4 countries sent troops to Russia immediately after the revolution to coordinate their invasion with the effort of the White Army inside Russia to overthrow this new little government. And the 4 countries were Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. 10,000 troops, which in those conditions of the country were a very powerful force. This was to destroy a government which was already reeling from the fact that it hadn't been prepared for a successful revolution itself, and that this was a country that had just been defeated in World War I. Decimated, because a lot of it was fought there, destroyed politically, culturally, economically. This was extraordinary. They won the Civil War, having made the revolution, and they defeated the invasion. And they created something called the Comintern, an international organization of Marxist communists all over the world who had never been unified in anything comparable to what they were now about to get from the Russians. The internationals before were very different from what they created. And not the least of the achievements, something Lenin personally oversaw, was the production of the works of Marx in every language on the face of this earth, in cheap editions that were distributed in every country on the face of the earth in the subsequent 50 years. It is no exaggeration to say that most of the last 100 years of acquaintance with the works of Marx that happened around the world happened because of the decision of the Soviet Union under Lenin's leadership to make that literature available everywhere. There was a confidence in learning. So let me use that as a segue into the next theme that I think we can learn from Lenin. In the midst of the most intense political organizing in the intense personal crises of being an activist and a militant, Lenin always devoted large portions of his time and energy to what we loosely refer to in this country as research and scholarship. I don't know if any of you have had a chance, but if you have a moment, there is a book called The History of Capitalism in Russia. Big, fat volume, 2-3 inches fat, written by Lenin at the end of the 19th century, that he felt was necessary to understand what exactly, as Colleen pointed out, what are we facing here in Russia? What is the relationship between little peasants who barely own their own land and are scrabbling to survive versus those who have employees? What remains of feudalism in Russia? Because remember, feudalism lasted longer in Russia than in the rest of Europe. How do we handle all of that rapidly transformed breaking down of the old feudalism, but also the destruction of the little peasants that had emerged and who didn't know, here we go, where to turn in coping with the disintegration of their life opportunities? These were rural people. The land was everything for them. He devoted himself to figuring that out. And as he did the research, he discovered that doing a domestic analysis wasn't enough, because the weakness of Russia had allowed Western capitalists, particularly the French, to come in and basically cut a deal with the Tsar that as feudal Russia was disintegrating, the elite could kind of slide over into modern capitalism by developing it in Russia in partnership with the foreigner, particularly the French, but also British, German, and so on. So that he had to write that famous pamphlet in which he finishes his analysis. First, the big book on Russian agriculture and how it is disintegrating and what the revolutionary meanings and opportunities are that that situation creates and how to deal with it, had to be supplemented by analyzing the international situation. And there Chris touched on the financialization, which was happening fast in Russia, together with this imperialism, which for him represented this, his phrase, latest, sometimes translated as highest stage of capitalism. It didn't mean high in some abstract notion, it's just the most recent form that it takes, and that we, the revolutionaries, have to analyze and manage this transformation at home, in agriculture domestically, and in finance, and in the imperialism. Why? Because Russia has become an outpost of imperialism that the rest of imperialism needs, but this outpost is very vulnerable because it is in a context that may make it impossible to survive a challenge. You mean, to jump ahead, that Russia, because of its backwardness, could become a very weak link in a capitalist global chain, and might therefore be destabilized enough by its peculiar position to make it possible for a tiny group of people, which the Bolsheviks were, to be able to do something there they couldn't imagine doing under other circumstances. It was a very careful, difficult, elaborate analytic that led to a strategic commitment. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that's a really good model of how to go about these things, and we could learn a lot, making adjustments for the different conditions now, from the methodology, as Colleen said, of this way of thinking about it, and being respectful. Not each of us has to do it, but being respectful of the work being done by our friends and neighbors who are trying in their own way to understand American capitalism, to figure out what comparable or parallel lessons we could get. So I want to take my hat off to Mr. Lenin for being an activist, supremely interested, as others have pointed out, in power and how to deal with power, and what the relations of power are, but also doing the heavy lifting of an analytic to put that in the context that a good Marxist ought to in terms of what the hell is happening to the basic economic lives that people are trying to survive in. The second thing I think Lenin teaches us, and that his works reveal if you work through them, is an extraordinary appreciation and commitment to doing what an awful lot of folks believe is abstract and unnecessary philosophizing. Here's a quote from Lenin. Anyone who has not mastered Hegel's dialectic cannot understand Marxism. Whoa, that's pretty heavy. I'm going to ask people to raise their hands as to how much Hegel they have struggled with. Many Russians at that time wouldn't have known who Hegel was. Just as many Americans in this day and age haven't a clue either. For Lenin, this is the most serious problem. Why? He reads in Marx, and there's lots of disputes, of course, about this, but he reads in Marx the student of Hegel, the person who has tried to use certain basic concepts that come out of his teacher, Hegel, in his own work. I think that's a piece of good advice. I would actually urge on all of you to do it. It's a little difficult because Hegel's language is not the language you're used to, but it was worth it for Lenin, and I think it would be worth it for us. Let me give you just a couple of quick examples. One of the, by the way, there are long notebooks that Lenin has that are available. You can read them. His notebooks on Hegel, so you can see what exactly in Hegel Lenin was interested in, and so. And you can, by the way, there are people who have thought about this and written about this. Probably the best single book, if you're interested, is by the French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, who wrote a book called Lenin and Philosophy. Hint. He thought it was really important, and I think you would find it too. The French have been the leaders in this effort to see Marx and Hegel and Lenin connect. Another writer, if you're interested, is Jean Hippolyte, Hyppolite, Marx and Hegel. And then the greatest of all the Hegel scholars in France, a person who gave lectures that were so captivating, the man's name was Alexander Kojève, K-O-J-E-V-E, that in his classes were Levi-Strauss and Jean-Paul Sartre and Teilhard de Chardin, and you name it, the literary greats of France in the World War II, the post-war period, they all were students together in the lectures on Hegel given by Kojève, which are also available in English. Well, one idea of Hegel's is that everything in the world is contradictory. There is no one-sidedness of anything. Everything is wrapped up in its own negation. Your life is bounded by your death. And because your death is a boundary of your life, and everything in your life affects everything else, so then your death shapes your life too, just as your life shapes your death. What we think as individuals shapes the world we're living in, just as that world shapes how we think. It's not one or the other, it is both of them together. Anything that is created, therefore, by revolutionaries contains within it the negation of what they're trying to do. That's not because of a failure, now they know about it. That's the way it is. And the effort to get rid of that opposite in your good intentions is a little bit like that dog running after his own tail. We're not going to get there, even though he tries. Oh, God, does he try. This is really important, though. It means that when you create a political party, it is going to be a mechanism to advance your project, but it's also going to contain obstacles. And you're going to have to work with that. You're not going to eliminate the other. You're not going to find some magic bullet that gets you what you want without the negation threatening you at every time. That's crazy from the Hegelian perspective, that expectation. And then to go to work to produce the political party that has no contradictions. The collective effort that doesn't destroy the individual, or the individualism that doesn't destroy the collective, these become efforts of the folks who haven't read the Hegel. And Lenin's not happy with that. Chris has talked about the seizing of the moment, and I'll repeat that, but that is an extraordinary skill, as Chris's discussion made clear, to understand when the moment is, and then what it might mean to seize it, are the demands of a politically self-aware movement. It's one thing to wait for them to happen, because you kind of have to. But then the question is to recognize when it is and to see what can be done in that moment. Again, with the contradiction that the steps you take will close as many opportunities as they open. And that's not to be evaded as a mistake. That's the nature of the process that you're involved in. Because of time, let me jump to a couple more things that I think deserve real attention. Lenin made the following statement 2 or 3 years, just to remind you for history. The revolution is in 1917. Lenin effectively has a brain aneurysm and is out of it by 1922 and dies in 1923. So Lenin is the leader of the Soviet Union for 4 years. Stretch it 4.5. Be careful about holding him responsible for a little more than any person in power for that short period of time could possibly account for. But here's something he said 2 to 3 years into his position as the leader. We have achieved, he said, a public statement, we have achieved in the Soviet Union, in our first 3 or 4 years, state capitalism. Not my phrase, his phrase. We have not achieved socialism. I am hopeful that we can and will achieve socialism because the state is in the hands of a revolutionary party, our party, which can and hopefully will use it to make the transition. Please notice, no claim that socialism has been achieved. None. An explicit recognition that they haven't been able to do that. And that remains something to be done. How different then, less than 10 years later, his successor, Joseph Stalin, announces that socialism has been achieved. And the rest of the world then debates whether or not socialism can exist in one country or not. Famous arguments that were had about that. Lenin never claimed this. He understood that what had happened was that the government had seized the means of production. But because it continued to relate to the mass of people in the employer-employee relationship, this wasn't the elimination of capitalism. It was just that the state had become a capitalist too. Which, if you think about it, has enormous historical relevance. You know why? Because in slavery, there were often state slavery, state slave owners, state masters, alongside private ones. There were states who had serfs alongside private lords who had serfs. The addition of a state ownership of a slave or a state landowner with serfs doesn't lead anybody to say, well, it's not serfdom anymore because the state's doing it too. Or it's not slavery anymore because the state's doing it too. But we live in a world which thinks that when the state does capitalist employment, we don't have capitalism anymore. Oh, bizarre. That's weird. That's what ought to be questioned, not assumed. If the state mimics the private, if it becomes the employer just like the private, which is pretty much what we have, then where does this qualify for a post-capitalism? The very idea is cuckoo. And Lenin got that. And not only did he get it as a general proposition, but he got it about his own achievement inside Russia. They hadn't produced socialism because they had not yet figured out how to transform beyond the employer and employee system. Which ties into another point that he made towards the end of his life. We had undervalued, he said in a famous speech, worker co-ops, which had existed in Russia, existed before the revolution, just like they exist in every country, ours included here in the United States, and they have. And you could see in Lenin's final remarks there that maybe the worker co-op for him was that missing next step, which, had they been aware of it, the leaders of the Soviet Union, had they shared this notion that it's state capitalism, might have seen as the way to make that next step to socialism. Lenin gives us pretty much all the reasons to think that and to pursue that idea, but you have to recognize and see that in Lenin's work to go that last step. So let me conclude then. I think Lenin was an extraordinary leader. As Chris said, and I couldn't agree more, really, he deserves enormous credit for having basically rewritten the rest of the history of the 20th century. Alfred Mayer from Princeton had a wonderful book in which he basically explains that American foreign policy after 1917 and that of most of the Western capitalist world was an attempt to cope with what happened in Russia. 47 different ways, often denied, but he does the historical work to lay that argument out. If you've never seen that book, it's a masterpiece. I don't know what the title is. But look at Mayer, Alfred. I believe it's Alfred Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R. What? Not Arnold. I don't think so. Well, I'm not sure, but Mayer is the guy. The Norman, it's a history of Russia and the foreign policy of the West after the revolution and so on. But it does that work, and it does it really well. Gabriel Kolko did something like that in a different context in the United States later. Okay, so I think he was a great leader. I think he worked in extraordinary circumstances. I understand, but like every leader, let alone a great leader, much of what comes afterwards is put under his responsibility, and to some degree that's always true. But I don't think in this case, dwelling on it the way so many of the enemies have of the Soviet Union and of socialism and of Lenin, I don't think that's the urgent need of our time. Last point. On anarchism and Lenin. The phrase, the withering away of the state, I believe that was his contribution to the notion at his time that that was among the goals of the Russian Revolution. I don't think most of the people who have studied the relationship, troubled relationship, all the way back from Marx and Bakunin and all the rest, give enough credit to Mr. Lenin for having understood that the conditions of the mass of poor peasants in Russia, those who come out of the dissolution of feudalism in Russia, made them particularly suspicious of all authority. Feudalism is a place where the economic and the political are all together in the lower, the landlord has total power. Their deep commitment to what we would now call a variety of anarchism, which is why so much of modern anarchism comes out of Russia and comes through the thinking of Russians, whether it is Akuno or all the others. That had to be accommodated. I think he understood that. I think that's why the withering of the way of the state was his way of saying, yes, we created a very powerful state, but it is not our intention that that be a part of what we call socialism. It is something we need to do now to survive from the withering away of the state, so the state becomes merely an administrative relationship among the power at the base. And that points more towards the worker co-op idea of a social structure than it does on what in fact happened in the Soviet Union afterwards. So for all those reasons, I would urge you, like with all the other writers that Laura, Chris, and I have been talking about over the last several years, this is a man whose work, like that of Rosa Luxemburg or Tom Paine or any of the others, really deserves your engagement. You will learn important things about the issues you're concerned with right now, like how to understand the Trump phenomenon, or what to do with the wisdom that Chris lays out, that after, in 2020, with or without Mr. Trump, all of the crap sits there, facing us. And then we have to, in a sense, go beyond the symbol of the disintegration that's going on around us to get at that disintegration and how we intervene. I think Lenin is a big, big help in doing that. Thank you.
Floor. And at that point, we're going to take questions from the floor, which we will re-articulate for the purpose of the recording. It also occurs to me that you may have questions of one another based on what you've heard. But there are a few things I would love to hear you address. One for you, Chris. You perhaps in a flip moment talked about, I hope none of you watched the debates. And I understand. But I'm also reminded of Lenin in his writings about infantile disorders, especially left communism, that he talked about politics beginning where the millions are. And I wonder how you square that today, that thought, that politics begin, I looked it up, I think I have it right, politics begin where millions of men and women are, where there are not thousands but millions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I have a question for some of the others, but do you want to start with that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, what we're watching is not politics.
It's the mic.
Maybe you have to come up here, that's all.
Yeah.
Give it. Sorry. This mic isn't amplifying, only this one. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not politics, it's anti-politics. These aren't political issues. They're cultural and social issues masquerading identity politics as politics. It's all centered around political personalities. And so what's sold to us as political debate is essentially a political version of ESPN. So I didn't watch the debates. On the whole notion of 2 years of this, I just lived through Russiagate. 2 years of this garbage. And did Camilla Harris give the knockout punch? I mean, that's not the language they use. I mean, that's great. So I would argue that the impoverishment of political discourse is such that what is presented to us as politics is, and Benjamin DeMont wrote a good book on this called Junk Politics is Not Politics. Let me just respond a little bit to Rick, and then I'll let them respond. So I think we have to accept the fact that the Bolsheviks had nothing to do with the February Revolution. Even they admit that. They did not orchestrate the demonstrations. Lenin was quite clear that there would have been no revolution without the destruction of the Russian military, the 5 regiments in Petrograd. As a matter of fact, many of them murdered their officers and generals. They refused to defend the Tsar. There was an eruption because there was a huge shortage of flour. There was no bread in the city. Lenin was in Switzerland, caught completely unaware. So they really had nothing to do with the February Revolution. In that period between the arrival, Lenin arrived at Finland Station after going through a sealed railway car from Germany. That period between the February Revolution and the rise of a weak government led by Kerensky and the Duma, we saw that the Bolsheviks refused to engage. I mean, Lenin was quite prescient in that, and Pravda, the newspaper that he founded after the revolution, was suddenly allowed to reappear, and he comes back to Russia. Kamenov and Stalin were running it, and he's furious because they had said that they would support the war. And he said, absolutely, we do not support the war. We do not participate in the provisional government, and we arm the workers. And so what you saw was essentially a destruction of the Soviets. I mean, we talk about, and these were the Soviets were worker committees, they'd taken over factories, they had the means of production. And when Lenin carries out a coup, because he arms the Red Guard in October, in the name of the Soviets, even though he hadn't consulted with any of the Soviets, and he holds a meeting that night in that girls' school where the Bolshevik headquarters, and he invites the SR and the social, which were much larger than the Bolsheviks, and announces that he has taken power in the name of the Soviets. And of course, it's the fatal mistake of the socialist parties that they walk out and leave a power vacuum that Lenin filled. But I think that it's not correct to say that they orchestrated the revolution, and I think most of the writers on the revolution, including Trotsky and everyone else, will acknowledge that. So I guess that's the most important point, that what they did is, and this was Lenin's brilliance, and I think it is important to accept the fact, and you can read this with Che Guevara, he was in Guatemala in '54 when Arbenz was overthrown. He learned and he understood, like Lenin, that imperialism will stop at nothing to crush the socialist movement, and I think that is a legitimate argument, and I don't have an easy answer for it, which I perhaps both Rick and Kale are more sympathetic to, that Lenin had to employ these draconian Bolsheviks, had to employ these draconian measures in order to retain power. I'm not going to say that that was wrong, but I do want to say that they didn't create the revolution. They seized the moment. And there was one last thing. In October, despite that the great film, what's that film, Eisenstein's film? What is it? Yeah, it's totally fake. There was more people died in the February uprising than in the October. They pretty much, John Reed points out, they pretty much just walked into the Winter Palace. It was that what happened was the provisional government, like the Tsarist regime, collapsed under its own rot and ineffectiveness. And so anyway.
I fear that Rick will want to come back with that. So I want to bring a colleague up next and ask him, at various points in Lenin's own life, but also in the years since, people have seen the potential for alliances between workers in sort of what Lenin would refer to as kind of heartland capitalist nations and those involved in liberation struggles on the receiving end of empire. And I would go with Chris just a little and suggest that it's our capitalist media that have given us an interpretation of identity politics that is different from liberation politics. But I think that's one of the topics we're going to be addressing this weekend to some extent. But if one were to consider liberation politics and that notion of liberation to include both anti-imperial liberation, anti-patriarchy liberation, white supremacy liberation, then where do you see those potentials for alliances today? And you need to use this again, I'm sorry. So the alliance between the working class and liberation movements internationally and domestically.
Well, I mean,
You're living one.
let me start by saying that I think that in some respects how we're using, like how that's framed, I think is a bit off. Why do I say that? Because I think there's part of how that framing is situated that we took from Lenin is that there's kind of the developed industrial West, and then there's the underdeveloped colonized, i.e. later third world countries. And where it's expressed as if there's very minimal proletariat, mainly large peasant agricultural framework in part of that analysis, which is implicit in it. We now live in an era where the proletariat is actually, I'm going to use the old school world, is actually larger than it's ever been in history. Right? When you look at the inclusion of folks primarily in Asia, the growing proletariatization which is taking place on the African continent, and also other parts of Asia, it's larger than it's ever been. And so part of that is how do we re-articulate and understand the working class in its totality? That's a piece that I think requires a global analysis that I don't see us doing on a whole, throughout the left. And so without that critical analysis of how production is actually taking place on a global scale, certain opportunities aren't even explored, let alone, people thinking critically, how do we relate, concretely to folks who are making clothes in Thailand or India, in Jackson, right? With folks who are not working, basically, or only working in McDonald's or working at Walmart, which is the largest employer in the state of Mississippi. Grapple with that. To a certain so I think, to me, I'm going to use kind of a cliche language, but I think it begs strategy that there's opportunity all over the place. Right? There's no shortage of opportunity in the present world. What there is a lack of organization. Right? There's a lack of organization to be able to seize upon and identify the opportunities for us to act upon. So I know in my, just in my little corner of the work right now, I'll just bring it home like within Cooperation Jackson. I say opportunities everywhere. I don't have the capacity nor the organization to actually follow through and make it. But I see the links all the time that if we could do this, if we could, put that together. If we had a bridging force here of some group that was bringing together all the different cooperatives, with a similar framework and ideology that we're not just trying to build co-ops for cooperative sake, but as a means to build socialism from below, very clearly, very explicitly. Like that particular type of organization, unfortunately, right now doesn't exist. So we can identify opportunities everywhere. Do we actually have the ability to move on them? That's what's missing. But I think, I personally think that we live in an era, going back to the previous question. I think that there are millions and millions of people who want to engage politics, like concretely, but they want it to be of substance. And what people are being presented with very clearly is, the trappings of politics, be it voting or, other little, like it's not changing my actual lived experience.
What about movements? I'm thinking of movements like Black Lives Matter, for example.
You mean like how should we connect with those? I see the forces underneath that as being part of the alliance. I don't see the entity that's being called that as the driving force, right? And why do I say that? Because if many folks would identify that with Trayvon Martin a couple of years ago before, Black Lives Matter as a hashtag become a movement exists. Those objective forces in the Black community were already there, right? And they were just as primed to be organized in a particular way in 2009 as they were in 2014. And that's still true today, even though some of the kind of the motion has seemingly died down. I think some sectors are actually figuring out an organizing strategy that would sustain them, which is not, so it looks like it's not as active, but actually I think it's more broader and deeper. But yeah, I think that's there. But again, it comes to me is what we have oftentimes is, and I think Chris spoke to her, we have these eruptions, these episodic eruptions of mass activity. But then it often falls short because, you can't stay in the squares forever, right? We can't occupy the freeways and do the blockades forever, right? So how do we actually build the type of force that could then take those actions on command? So that's the difference, despite, what people want to criticize about Lenin and the type of party he created. The difference, I would argue, Chris, back to your point, I think Lenin identified to a certain extent a missed opportunity that happened in February of saying that folks should have been involved in their analysis and projection was wrong, but you got to remember, they were also, at that particular point in time, more focused in on working within the Soviets and working to deconstruct the army, right? That was primarily their focus, not what was going on there. But since we missed an opportunity, we know we better from the last go around, a couple of years ago, we better move on consolidating some things now before there's an opportunity by, in his assessment, which I think was correct, by liberals to turn this back over and give it away, right? And we've seen that time and time again. We've had, I would argue, let's open this up to debate, like part of what happened in Egypt was the same surrendering. Right, is that the forces who kind of opened up the space were not the forces who were able to fill the vacuum of power that was created. And so there was a brief experiment which was tolerated for a quick second, I think often for some very cynical strategic purposes, to put the Muslim Brotherhood in place, only to make sure that it failed so they could bring back the same old regime and under the name of stability. This is an old game that I think we have to figure out, that I think he made a conscious effort to intervene in, but then I think there's some deeper pieces that to me that connect, and I'm gonna stop, that connect to what Rick was saying. When the Bolsheviks took over, they really did not have, this is just one thing, they really did not have a comprehensive, concrete way about how we actually going to manage and transform the economy. And just assume that we can take over from what capitalism was doing and the way it was doing it to a certain extent, and just replace it with the new kind of bureaucracy and maybe empower more workers to have a say at the point of reduction, right? But they didn't have a comprehensive plan, in order to do that. Now, I don't think we can fault them for not having it, because nobody had any experience of doing anything to that level. We now have that. So now there's a different set of questions the next go around that we have to answer.
Well, I guess that was my question. Take that first. That was the second time. That was really my question for Rick, and then we'll open it up to the floor, which was, how are we doing on the ideas front when it comes to the ideas of reorganizing a society? And are we keeping up with the? How are we doing when it comes to having the concrete ideas that will change that will remake our economy? And how are we doing understanding the moment that we're in, especially as it pertains to individualism of the sort that Shoshana Zuboff writes about in Surveillance Capitalism, where she is literally suggesting that we have, or makes a very good argument, that we have a new form of capitalism that is built on our neoliberalism created individualism. And this, it seems to me, throws up a challenge which is both old and new, in the sense that the tools of capitalism are different, but it's critical in the way that Lenin did talk about discipline. And democratic socialists after him have talked about discipline and instruction, and how do you send people from here to there to do the organizing? Are we really, are we strategic in that kind of way? And then finally, Lenin had an idea of, basically he clung to the notion that there are two ideologies, bourgeois and socialist. And so my question is that still true? And that comes to you, that question comes to you, Rick, because I think it's in that area of cooperative economics that in our work, I'm often asking myself, is this about the collective or the individual? It can be both in different moments and in different structures. So if you want to answer that or any other question that's come come up, and then we'll come to the audience. And I'm just going to tell you, I want questions with question marks at the end.
Let me try to respond. Quite a few things have been brought up. I like Chris's answer that it isn't really politics, it's more theater or some other term you might want to use. I don't want to need theater. It's more of a show, is a better word for it. And yet again, the dialectic, Hegel's complicated idea. That debate, whether you watched it or not, was the scene of the influence of Marxism, even while it was a scene of the absence of Marxism. It really is both. That's the Hegelian moment in all of this. How is it the presence? I thought you might be interested. I happen to personally know two of the fathers of the people running for the Democratic nomination. I know them, one is deceased, one is still alive. I know them because I worked with them for years. I know exactly how they think. I've written with them and I've done research with them. Those are both long-time, lifelong, committed Marxists. Kamala Harris's father, Don Harris, was one. Is one. I worked with him for years. This is personal information you're getting. And Mr. Buttigieg's father was a very committed Marxist intellectual all his adult life. He was one of the people who formed and organized the International Gramsci Society, which has been the institution that collected, published the works of Gramsci in multiple languages, organized regular international conferences, several of which I've attended, etc., etc. So you had on display in Kamala Harris and in Peter Buttigieg. By the way, he is a mayor of South Bend, Indiana, because his father was a professor at Notre Dame, which is in South Bend, Indiana, which is why he's there. Kamala Harris comes from California. Her father, Don, was a professor of economics at Stanford. No mystery there, although I'm sure this information is not widely known, although if either of them becomes the candidate for something, it probably will be. I'm certainly not alone in telling you this. But of course Marxism was shaping those people. How could it otherwise be? And yet they're also running away from it, whether they're consciously doing that or not is not the issue. But Marxism is there. Marxism has its influence in what they say and how they say it and how they see it and how they work with it and how they dream about it and all the other ways. It's absent. You can see how far they have come from where they come from. But you know, you can never take it all out of the person where you come from, and they haven't been able to remove it either. And you'll perhaps see more of it later on. I would say that Lenin is quoted often, I'm not sure he's the only one who said it, but something like this: revolutions only can succeed if two conditions are fulfilled. One, that the conditions of life have become intolerable, and number two, that the people in charge are no longer have the confidence of those who find it intolerable. If we can't stand it, and these people are going to fix it. I think we are making a lot more progress and a lot faster in the last few years in this country in real life. Well, I mean seriously, and I think that Laura in her work, Collie in his, Chris in his, I in mine, we're all different, we do it differently, but we are, that's what we do. We are trying to let people understand that it's okay to face that your conditions are becoming intolerable. In fact, we kind of urge you to see it a bit clearer than you might otherwise. And we are certainly giving you the message that the people in charge don't know how to fix it, don't even understand it, and if they did, wouldn't want to fix it anyway, since it's working for them. We're doing that real well, which leads me then to answer Laura's question. What's missing? That's why Lenin is important. What's missing is how we do it. It's the organization. It's the organization. And if the victories of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or if it is indeed a victory of Caban for the district attorney in Queens, if these things reflect anything, they reflect the fact that they produce some organizations, and at least that task, which is far from what we need, but that task of getting rid of a dead old Democratic Party hack operation is within our reach. They've proven that now in a relatively short time with the kind of people that are in this room, and this is more than enough what's in this room to transform many of these areas. So I'm kind of hopeful that as we deepen the understanding that the conditions are intolerable and that the people in charge are no way going to solve it, that the organizational question, another reason to be Lenin, is coming to the fore, and we're trying desperately to solve that problem, Kali in a very practical way. And one of the wonderful things about Kali that I enjoy most when I listen to him is that there's no bullshit about it. He's really serious. He's always telling us, here's where we can go, these are the problems, these are the obstacles. That's what we need. To face the contradictions and the obstacles, continue the goal, but without faking the way those debates are so fake, what we actually face.
All right, thank you so much. As people who know, I practice a very aggressive form of affirmative action. So let's have 3 good questions. 1. Well, that was first. 2. Come on. We have no people of color with a question. Come on now. We certainly do. Okay, great. All right. 1, 2, 3. So right here.
Thank you. This is very enlightening. I'd like you to apply what you're talking about, Lenin, to what's going on now with the Yellow Vest movement. And it was exciting to hear about whatever stirs up revolution is mysterious sometimes. Chris was saying the OWS movement, Arab Spring, and now with the Yellow Vest, seizing the opportunity.
Okay.
And neoliberalism, corporatism is a global enemy to all of us. So I think we have to organize internationally and try to support each other. And just a PS, I tweet a lot, and I have a lot of exciting conversations with people in other countries now. I don't know how long that's going to last, but connecting dots and different issues.
So what would Lenin make of the Yellow Vests, and where's our internationalism? Over there.
Yeah, just a quick humorous point. I have 3 kids and 7 grandchildren. I'm a lifelong Marxist, and I haven't raised one of them as a Marxist yet. So the time I think it's totally operational in my family. But in any case, a question for all of you. To my knowledge, on day 1 of the Russian Revolution, they nationalized all the land in the largest country on earth, 6 of the country, gave it to the peasants. The Bolsheviks won a majority in the Soviets and established a military revolutionary committee that was headed by Trotsky to organize a seizure of power. Their first days, they granted the right of self-determination of all the oppressed nationalities. They abolished all imperialist treaties. They abolished every law discriminating against women, LGBTQI people, and they established for the first time in human history the role of a Soviet government of workers, peasants, and farmers, not the Bolshevik Party, to rule the country democratically in the tradition of the Paris Commune.
I'm listening to that question.
My question is, Chris, your remarks seem to negate what Lenin, Trotsky, and virtually every writer I know on the Russian Revolution argue. How do you account for this?
Well,
All right, wait, we're going to get the 3rd
not
question.
fully,
and response.
he believes this is the Russian Revolution.
Whoa, wait. 3rd question, over here. Yeah.
Thank you.
3rd question is over here. No, the woman here.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for asking for people of color to ask questions. Look at the room, and I'd like to ask the panel, especially Kali, but the other brothers can also chime in. How do we use the language of the youth which in some cases, especially in Jackson, is in music, to bring in Lenin, because they can do it. And what do you suggest?
All right, I'll give one bonus question to the guy. Go ahead.
Okay, so the question
Maybe
is
I'm being unfair.
timing, flexibility, priority. So you know when they sent Trotsky to Germany to sign the peace deal, they told him you have to wear a tuxedo. He balked. He wrote back. He said they want you to wear a tuxedo. Then he said, if they want you to wear a dress, wear the dress and sign the peace deal. And I think Trotsky would have looked great in a dress. But the question is, militarism is the single overriding problem. And the question is, how do you build the broadest possible coalition internationally and across classes to deal with militarism? Because if we can't deal with militarism, we can't deal with anything else.
All right, so three questions. What would Lenin have made of the yellow vests, and where is our internationalism? That's it, so sorry, we've got time for. Chris, don't you see what they did? The language of youth, the youth movements in this moment, how can we use them? What would Lenin advise? And then, is the number...
How could they translate Lenin
Oh, I'm
into their
sorry.
language?
Better way of phrasing it. What she said. And then, how do we, as a matter of urgency, create the broadest possible movement against militarism as the number one threat? And do you, I guess, agree that that is the number one requirement at this moment? I think you could all who hasn't got the mic, Jean? Chris, I'm going to give you this one.
So, in terms of...
They need to come back in. Oh, okay, sorry. Why don't you three of you come back? I'm encouraged.
So, in terms, you can't be a socialist unless you're an anti-imperialist. It's impossible. This is the problem with Bernie Sanders. That's number one. And it's Alexander Berkman. The greatest enemy is within. And by that he means the military machine. And Lenin understood that. He understood that the revolution was made possible because with the disastrous losses in World War I, the Russian military machine was destroyed. All of the elite regiments, as I mentioned before in Petrograd, would no longer defend a discredited regime. That gave them their opening. In terms of the history, well, remember, when Lenin took power, everything was an edict signed by Lenin. And if you read Volin's The Unknown Revolution, or you read Averich's history, the anarchist movement, which was much stronger than the Bolsheviks, was decimated by the Cheka and destroyed through repression. And yet, of course, Lenin spoke in the name of the Soviets, the very movements, and these had autonomous powers and workers' committees to centralize power. What was the last thing?
Well, what do you think of the yellow vests?
Oh, that's interesting. So I was actually in Paris not long ago, and when with the Yellow Vest movement. And it has a direct tie to the Russian Revolution, as every revolution. So I covered all the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. And what happens is they get out into the street, and what they ask for is so minimal. In the case of East Germany, we started in Leipzig. They asked that their opposition organization be given legal status, recognized as and by the end they're calling for the overthrow of Honecker. And same thing with the Yellow Vest. It begins with a tax on fuel, ends up with calling for the overthrow of Macron. And the same thing happened in Russia. They originally got out on the street asking for bread, and very quickly they were calling for the overthrow of the Tsar, and they hated the Tsarina, they called her the German woman. And so that, and I think, colleagues can really speak to this even better than I can, but that note that the process of radicalization begins with the act of defiance. It's the physical experience of defying power, and that often in almost all revolutionary movements, including in Russia, the initial demand is very minimal, but it very swiftly takes on a character of bringing down the entire regime.
let me bring Kali up to answer any of the questions that he wants to ask, but I want him up to have to answer.
He may have something ready.
Okay, great. But I do want someone to address the question of how could Leninism be made better by paying close attention to the language of youth, particularly in this moment.
Okay, to be a bit provocative, yes, absolutely, the revolutionary things start with a minimalist demand for bread or for getting rid of that fuel tax. But one of the key determinants of whether it goes beyond that is not some intrinsic logic that drives people, but precisely whether or not there's an organized group that have thought through what is the problem and can make the case to those involved in struggling for bread that the only secure way to provide bread to yourself is not to get an okay that they'll bring a truck with bread, but to get a transformation of the system, because otherwise you're going to get the reform you want, but you leave in place the power structure that will take it away the minute you go home and watch TV. In other words, the reform is never secure. It's not a struggle between reform and revolution. The only way forward is revolution. We've done the reforms 50 times. The New Deal was a reform. The reason we don't have it anymore is that people who have the power were left with the power to take it away after the moment. So to demand, all due respect to the people I admire who are struggling now, to demand another New Deal gets from the consciousness of the American worker the answer, been there, done that, I'm not doing that again. I understand, even if I can't put it into words, it's too fragile. These reforms leave in place their own negation, number one. Number two, I think that the youth community, with their language and their music and their tonal voice, they're not strangers. They're people who, if there were the desire to talk and communicate, a commitment to the issues they put forward, the same interaction between us and them that has been possible with every other such movement is possible in this case. No impenetrable barrier that I see. Last point. We made an effort at the left wing, a hard effort that was difficult, to bring multiple yellow vest contingents here. They are here this weekend. Some have just come from France to participate in the left wing. You'll find the panels in the booklet that will tell you where and when. They have different perspectives. My family is French. Participated in French politics, speaking French since my father was born in France, in love with it. It's a wonderful illustration. There you have not just the idea of revolution, not just the need for it, but you have the masses of people in the streets up against the cops. Some of them have gotten seriously hurt. I assume you follow that a little bit. But here's the thing. They are so, I'm not talking about everyone, but the preponderance is so alienated from the existing political parties, left and right, and in the middle, that they want nothing, the largest part, they want nothing to do with them. They won't let them come in, to some degree they can't block it, but in general they won't welcome them to have the interaction to let it go forward. So it's interesting that in that case, enough communication happened that they did escalate from the hostility to the fuel tax, which set it off, to the demand that Macron disappear. Macron, by the way, is as popular in France as Mr. Trump is here, less so actually, in terms of the polls. But it's a wonderful case in which the alienation with the political parties has held back the ability to make the connection.
Thank you, Richard.
So I'll try to focus on the one I felt was the least touched on. So this issue of translation. I think first and foremost, folks have to grapple and get deeper, talking about the youth and collective music. Folks have to grapple and get deeper in understanding their own experience. And we work with a fair number of artists in Jackson, and part of our kind of recent articulation of strategy is doing that much more intentionally. Graphic arts, music, revitalizing an effort to do cultural workers co-op. And what we're seeing is folks really trying to grasp the reality of their kind of expectations, their struggles, and also coming to grips with their own situation. In the course of doing that, I think people will discover the tools that are necessary if they stick with the engagement and ask the right questions. That will lead them to Lenin and whoever else people feel are necessary to draw from. And then they'll translate it on their own. I mean, that's not something that we're going to have to interject. And I say that coming from being a culture worker most of my life in one form or another. People are going to figure that out. Now, I think where I see myself as someone from an older generation is trying to impart the lessons, hard lessons that I've heard in other generations of, some of these things we've been there and done that. So why don't you look at it this way? Why don't you ask this question? This is why we made these decisions. This is what it led us to. That, I think, is a more critical gap than trying to provide people with a bunch of external information, right? And like, how do we build kind of a broad intergenerational piece, I think, is going to be the much more critical thing. Because, I'm learning from them a bunch of sources about revolutionary ideology that I didn't know about 4 or 5 years ago. So this is not, I think our engagement with you, it ain't a one-way, kind of train or transmission belt. There's some things that they have to teach, us. And there's a crux that I haven't heard mentioned here, really one critical time about how many of the youth, because of how at least I read it, how their neoliberalism over the last 30 years has broken down solidarity. There's a way in which they are living in their own bodies through experiences primarily as queer identified folks, which are challenging all the different categories that we would understand to be good or bad, binary this or binary that. There's some revolutionary potential there that I don't know if we're seriously integrating or thinking about comprehensively within our own movement. So it's to flip that question around. What do we have to learn from this recent challenge of the social order through that particular set of practices and ideology? I think that's something we have to bring forward more clearly. That really leads us to what could a new society look like? Is it just going to be a replication of what we already know, which is better distribution of goods and services? Or is it actually going to be something liberatory? Like, that's a deeper question that I think we need to open up and answer, with some urgency.
Thank you, everybody. That we have committed to holding these events every year, and I don't know about the others, but every year I think really is just, and every year your presence and your seriousness, what you bring to this subject, whichever the subject is of the year, but of this ongoing investigation, is part of what we are catalyzing as power here. So I want to thank you for coming and continuing to illustrate how much intention there is and interest. And I want to encourage you, if you want to continue this kind of thinking and learning, check out all of the media represented at this, on this panel. And thank you again for your work and your interest.